In almost every field, you can find an example of jargon. In almost every field, you can find an example of jargon. That is, some word or phrase that may be hard to understand, especially to someone outside of that field. Consider these examples. In the medical field, idiopathic really means unknown cause. Or in finance, ROI is return on investment, which is really how much money you make on an investment, percentage-wise. In education, scaffolding really means the way the lesson is structured to move students to a stronger and higher understanding. In construction, assignable square footage really means the amount of square footage that can actually be used by an occupant. Jargon can be frustrating, especially when you are not in the field. It is confusing to outsiders. But in reality, jargon is used to express something specific, something telling, something quite important. Engagement, that term, is an example of jargon we often hear, like employee engagement. Employee engagement is a human resources concept that is defined as the level of enthusiasm and dedication a worker feels toward his or her job. Engaged employees care about their work and about the performance of the company and feel that their efforts make a difference. An engaged employee is in the job for more than a paycheck and may consider their well-being linked to their own performance and thus instrumental to their company's success. There is a powerful mutual benefit between the engaged employee and the organization. Sometimes engagement is boiled down to the 3 S's: say, stay, and strive. The first S, stay, an employee consistently speaks positively about the employer to core workers, customers, and job candidates. The second S, stay, an employee has a strong desire to remain with the organization despite having other opportunities. The third S, strive, is when an employee makes an extra effort to contribute to the organization's success. Today, we are exploring what engagement looks like in the church. We must remember, we are much more than employees as Orthodox Christians. If we claim to be God's servants, God's children, God's slaves, really, doulos means slave, there's a huge responsibility in claiming that identity. But how can we be engaged servants? We can look at the example of one of the greatest superstar employees, one of the greatest of God's servants, one of the most engaged, St. Paul, the Apostle. In today's epistle lesson, St. Paul wrote, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live." St. Paul was crucified with Christ, he says. Engagement is self-sacrifice. St. Paul noted, "It is no longer I who live." There was a major change in St. Paul's life. effort must be made to be engaged with God. A change of life is necessary. Even St. Paul, although very religious and educated, earlier in Galatians, he wrote about how he was beyond his peers in knowledge and in knowledge of his former faith, right, as a Jew. He still needed to be crucified for God, to live in a new engaged way for his Lord and Master. Critical components of engagement are self-sacrifice and change of life. We should ask ourselves, are we engaged employees, engaged servants of the Lord? Or do we do the minimum? Do we figuratively run out of the office door as soon as it turns 5 p.m.? Are we the first one on the bus or in the car like 5 minutes before 5 as we rush out of the office? Are we like the employees who don't work at self-improvement? Never doing the training or continuing education to learn more? Fight up against improving processes? Do we think someone else will pick up the slack? No one can be an engaged servant of the Lord for us. Sometimes we forget the definition of engagement and neglect to keep our goal of say, stay, and strive. When we describe St. Paul with today's jargon, St. Paul wholeheartedly lived the engagement components of say, stay, and strive. Regarding the first component, say, St. Paul continually spoke of God and his church to friends, strangers, Jews, Gentiles, to those who wouldn't accept the gospel, as well as those who did accept the gospel. He spoke about God as an engaged servant of the Lord. Although he wasn't an eloquent speaker, as he alludes to himself in 1 and 2 Corinthians, but what he said transformed many around him. And indeed, the course of Western civilization. What St. Paul said still touches us and moves us today. The second component, stay. St. Paul was in it for the long haul. He stuck with it through difficult times. He was beaten, rejected, slandered, lied about, all for the sake of the church. He was an engaged servant and stuck with it. As he wrote in today's epistle, "The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God." His whole life was transformed for the mutual benefit to himself and to the church. St. Paul would stay with it. The third component, strive. St. Paul strove for the church despite many factors against him. St. Paul wrote, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them." That's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. St. Paul was motivated by his recognition of what God had already done for him and what he continues to do for him. His life benefited the church just as the church benefited him. St. Paul wrote in today's epistle, "The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. The life of this engaged servant, St. Paul, stemmed from his realization of what God has already done and continues to do. St. Paul recognized what God did for him, and he couldn't help but strive for his church. But what does say, stay, and strive, these aspects of engagement, look like in regard to our time here at St. Mary's, in the community and also in our daily lives? How can we be engaged servants of God, producing a relationship of mutual benefit between us and the church? Soon you will receive a beautiful flyer produced by our own stewardship committee, and I thank them for their work. They have provided some key examples of engagement. Listen to these carefully. Engage with your family in prayer at home. That is the say component. Engage in relationships with your St. Mary's family. That is the stay component. Engage with your full being in the many worship opportunities. That is the strive component. Engage in studying your faith. That, again, is the strive component. Engage in a ministry. Again, that is the strive component of engagement. Say, stay, strive. Let us honestly ask ourselves if we are engaged servants of Christ and his holy church, his body. The term engagement should not remain jargon to us intellectually, but more importantly, experientially. Let it come a reality. Let our engagement with Christ's holy church become, as St. Paul put it, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. May we, too, imitating St. Paul, live a truly engaged life in the church. Amen.